Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going into an incredibly dense stack of documents. They lay out the calculus for what the sources are calling Round 2, a potential second major military conflict with Iran. Our mission is pretty straightforward. We're going to try and pull out the strategic intent from both sides, look at the pretty desperate economic realities driving this, and then get into the projected domestic fallout, which, frankly, the documents describe in shocking terms. This isn't just military analysis, it's about systemic instability. And what makes this so challenging is just how technical it all is. We're talking about specific strategic models.
Frameworks with code names, things like that.
Exactly. Frameworks like Alpha 1.0 and these quantitative scores. I mean, a domestic crisis score sitting at SV 8.25.
And that's tied directly to a U.S. strike needs score of IRL 7.9.
And these aren't just abstract numbers, are they?
Not at all. I mean, if we connect this to the bigger picture for you, these sources show a frighteningly tight link between escalating things abroad and a domestic political strategy. We're really moving past typical foreign policy here. We're assessing a kind of systemic fragility where conflict becomes a tool for internal governance.
Okay, so let's start with Iran's side of this. To understand their calculus for a Round 2, we have to look back at the confrontations they've already had. The sources cite those missile exchanges in April and October of 2024, and then that bigger 12-day war in June 2025.
Operation Rising Lion, as they called it internally.
Right, and their initial responses back in 2024 were very different.
Very different. The leadership framed them as limited and proportionate. It was a conscious signal of restraint, an attempt to avoid all-out war. They were showing they could hit back, but were actively choosing not to escalate.
But then June 2025 happens, and it seems like something fundamentally changed. They used that conflict almost like a live-fire laboratory.
Absolutely. The post-war assessment shows a really rapid adaptation. We have official statements right here from Foreign Minister Arachi, IRGC spokesman Naini.
And Commander Pakpor?
Exactly. And Arachi's takeaway is explicit. He says the June War gave us valuable experience because it revealed our weak points and we addressed them.
So they're signaling confidence now, not weakness.
A strategic evolution. And this shift is just critical for understanding where their heads are at for a Round 2. The consensus from all these officials is that any future response would be, and this is a quote, stronger, more decisive, or without previous restraints.
And Naini really defines that new reality, doesn't he? He says, if Israel attacks again, Tehran will have no red lines.
It's a huge shift. It sounds like they're moving past simple deterrence. They're defining the next conflict as an inevitability where they've taken their own restraints off the table.
And that all seems to be anchored to what happened in June 2025.
It is. They saw it as a massive violation. I mean, those initial Israeli strikes killed top military commanders, nuclear scientists. But the real key for them was the mixed messaging from the U.S.
Right, the claim and retraction. Secretary of State Rubio said it was a unilateral Israeli action.
And then just days later, President Trump publicly states he was very much in charge of that very, very powerful attack. From Tehran's perspective, that admission just removed all doubt about who the primary enemy was.
So the Speaker of Parliament, Ghalibaf, he calls it blatant aggression.
And demands the U.S. accept all the consequences, legal, political, military. For them, any past restraint was based on the idea that the conflict could be contained. With the U.S. owning the attacks, that assumption is gone. For Round 2, restraint is now strategically pointless.
Okay, so if Iran has removed its red lines and is actively adapting its military, what kind of U.S. strategy would actually want to provoke that? Let's shift to the U.S. side now, based on these unified crisis strategy documents. This is where, for me, the analysis gets really alarming.
It is, because it so explicitly merges foreign policy with these internal power grabs. The main goal is laid out in a framework they call Alpha 2.0, the dominance success model.
And under this model, success isn't, global stability or peace.
No. Success is defined as the unconstrained centralization of coercive and economic power, what sources call plenary authority at home.
Plenary authority. That's a very academic-sounding term. What does that actually mean for our listeners in practical terms?
Think of it as total, unchallenged executive power. It's the executive branch operating outside of the normal checks and balances from Congress and the courts.
Especially when it comes to the economy and the use of force.
Exactly. And Alpha 2.0 states that this centralization is the only definition of success.
So that's the end goal. How do these documents say they get there?
And that's where the operational plan, Alpha 1.0, comes in. They call it the Trump Chapter 11 thesis.
A corporate bankruptcy metaphor.
Right. In this model, the U.S. government is seen as the bankrupt company, and the president takes on the role of the debtor in possession, or DIP.
Debtor in possession, I've heard that from business news. What kind of power does that role grant someone?
Well, think about a real Chapter 11. The DIP gets extraordinary, temporary powers to restructure the company, powers that override normal contracts and operations. The sources argue the president sees the U.S. government as that failing company, and a state of national insolvency, a perpetual crisis, is the prerequisite for those special powers.
So if the power only exists during the crisis,
The crisis has to continue. If the bankruptcy ends, the DIP status goes away, and so do the extraordinary powers.
which means they have to manufacture the crisis. This idea, that the government is intentionally creating chaos to start a war. It sounds like a conspiracy theory. What in the documents makes this feel like a formal plan?
It's the meticulous detail. The sources list specific steps for what they call a controlled demolition to create this insolvency.
Like what?
Well, they detail the 39-day government shutdown. They categorize that as the political equivalent of a company stopping payment to its creditors. It's meant to prove that the operating agreement, the Constitution, has failed.
And then you have things like Project 2025.
Exactly. Project 2025 and the Schedule F purges. The analysis calls this shedding legacy costs, which means getting rid of institutional memory, career officials, anyone who might push back. And then there are the legal fights over emergency economic powers like IEPA and the challenges to SNA. These are described as tests to see if they can seize economic power and provoke the courts.
And all that manufactured chaos, all those tests, they translate into a number, the domestic crisis score.
Precisely. That's the currency. All that turmoil results in this high domestic crisis score of SV 8.25. And the analysis explicitly states that this domestic score is quantitatively linked to the political need for a U.S. strike, which gets its own score, IRL 7.9. The chaos at home becomes the reason for war abroad.
I want to stick with that link for a second because it really is the core of this whole thing. If the domestic crisis is already so high, why is round 2 so essential? Why not just govern in that crisis?
Because that domestic crisis, even with the high score, is politically debatable. More importantly, it's legally vulnerable. If the courts rule against the executive on IEPA or SNAT, the whole debtor in possession narrative just collapses. The powers would be gone instantly.
So round 2 is the...
It's the justification bridge. It's the ultimate, unassailable justification for that plenary power. A major foreign war triggers something called the political question doctrine that legally forces the judiciary to step back and defer to the executive on national security. It solidifies the Alpha 2.0 goal. The plan structurally requires conflict to succeed.
A planned war to secure domestic control. It's a staggering idea. But let's say the U.S. gets the trigger it wants and Iran makes good on its no red lines promise. What does the analysis actually predict for the outcome of the war itself? The forecasts are pretty severe.
They're more than severe. They're assessed as the most likely outcome. Before you even get to the war, the system is described as being in full cardiac arrest. The economy is just hanging by a thread, largely because of these manufactured domestic crises.
Right. The documents cite that 43-day government shutdown.
Which erased an estimated $92 billion. You have consumer sentiment at a near record low of 50.3. Layoffs are on par with 2008 and 2009. The system isn't robust, it's brittle. It's already been strained to the breaking point by political warfare at home.
So you take that brittle system and you throw a major war on top of it. A war where the other side has promised to hold nothing back. What are the odds of a catastrophic failure?
The analysis concludes that the war going badly wrong, and they define that as, say, a sunk aircraft carrier or massive U.S. casualties, is the most likely scenario, with estimated 80 to 90% odds.
80 to 90%. Let's just sit with that number. That's not a contingency plan.
No, that's a definitive forecast.
How can they justify odds that high?
It's tied to how they classify Iran as a resilient adversary, one that has spent decades developing asymmetric capabilities, things specifically designed to counter overwhelming U.S. conventional power. We're talking hypersonic missiles, cyber warfare, and the potential use of EMP weapons.
Which the sources note could, in some scenarios, essentially destroy the country as a functioning entity.
Right. So if that 80 to 90% scenario happens, the sunk carrier, the massive casualties, the model doesn't predict a recession. It predicts total systemic failure.
And the economic instability score, the EIS, it maxes out.
Instantly. It hits 75, which indicates a complete breakdown. The immediate triggers are what you'd expect. Oil prices skyrocketing and supply chains obliterated. The already weak domestic economy just collapses.
And the domestic fallout from that fragmentation. The odds